Well, hello there. Thanks for joining me today. I have kind of a sad story to tell about the U.S. military. I've been talking about the Department of Defense, our friends of the DoD. Hello there, gang. What are you doing on your computers today? The DoD, all that child pornography on the computers. Also, the fact that they have not been able to come up with a budget. So let's keep talking about the military for a little bit. I was looking into the deaths within the military organization. In other words, how many military people kill themselves? Because deaths are on the rise here in the United States. I mean, let's face it, people are not using those guns to murder other people. The studies are in. They're using those guns to commit suicide on themselves because of this horrific country that we live in, all of the trauma. So let me get started here. I found an article, but what I'll be doing really is I found what I've been looking for. Somebody from the Rolling Stone just came out with a book about what was going on during Afghanistan. I've been saying for years the U.S. military is the biggest drug runner in the world. The U.S. military is also in the children business. They've been talking about Iran being the biggest place for drugs these days. Well, who surrounds Iran? Look at the map. All you have to do is type in Iran and U.S. military bases. Iran is surrounded by U.S. military bases. So if Iran is the biggest world's drug smuggler right now, it's likely because they've taken over from Afghanistan. Not really, I'm just guessing here, okay? Just guessing. So did they move from Afghanistan more heavily into Iran? Yeah, probably, right? But first, let's talk about all these military deaths. The Pentagon finally stops hiding military overdose epidemic. After 15,293 overdoses and 332 deaths over 5 years, the military's top brass is ready to admit there's a problem. The U.S. Army Special Forces, better known as the Green Berets, has a serious problem with substance abuse and fatal drug overdoses. Gee, I wonder where they're getting the drugs from. Let's keep looking. The same is true of the Army's two most important infantry divisions, the 101st Airborne Division and the 82nd Airborne Division. That's the takeaway of data released by the Pentagon, and this was from last year, to a group of 5 senators. Because others grew concerned about rising drug use in the military after reading a report in the September issue of Rolling Stone. See, they had to read it in a report from Rolling Stone. You would think the military would be advising them about all of these deaths. Oh, wait a minute, I forget. The military doesn't have to advise anybody. The United States is a bankrupt corporation. Corporations are run by a president. All this business about talking to Congress and stuff, get that out of your silly little heads there. Just get that out of your heads. So they get this September issue of Rolling Stone. At least 14, as many as 30 American soldiers had died in 2020 and 2021 of overdoses at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Fort Bragg is the headquarters of the Special Forces, as well as the top secret Joint Special Operations Command, the Black Ops component of the military. The senators wrote a letter. Yeah, they always write these letters, right? I'm going to just send you a letter. I'm going to tell you everything I think about you in a harshly worded letter. Yeah, just like Hillary Clinton after the disaster in 2008, she literally said that she went to Wall Street and told them to knock it off. Yes, that's how much they're concerned about us. So I'll just keep reading here. So the senators wrote a letter to Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin requesting detailed statistics going back 5 years on accidental overdoses in the ranks. Accidental, you see, they say that accidental. These weren't accidental. We share your concern that drug overdose is a serious problem. These Pentagon's Undersecretary for Personnel and Readiness wrote in response this week, we must work to do better. A total of 15,293 American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines overdosed on illicit drugs from 2017 to 2022. Of those, 332 cases were fatal. Moral injury is a term often used in the context of veterans' health care to refer to the complex of symptoms arising from a damaged conscience, typically involving profound feelings of guilt, shame, and anger. Military personnel who participate directly in combat are most at risk of suffering this form of trauma, which is distinct from the heightened feelings of alertness and stress that characterizes PTSD. Pretty much all of these moral injury, anxiety, and mood-based disorder states are very frequently comorbid with substance abuse, they said. The Pentagon data makes clear that Fort Bragg, the beating heart of America's global special operations complex, is far and away the site of the most drug overdoses, both in absolute terms and per capita. With 31 confirmed overdoses since 2017, a rate of 36 per 100,000 soldiers. Besides North Carolina, the only other state with a major military population where service members died of overdoses at a significantly higher rate than the civilian population was Washington State, home of the Joint Base Lewis McChord, the headquarters of the 1st Special Forces Group. So they're killing themselves. The massive size and organizational structure of the DoD, Department of Defense, the people looking at child pornography, and the military health system is mind-boggling. There are millions links you can click, text alerts, phones you can jingle, hotlines with 3 numbers, chat apps. Nevertheless, she said, our duty of care to these soldiers is not being fulfilled because so many of these processes, and listen to this very carefully, so many of these processes are not designed to actually heal an individual human being, but to coldly assess whether he or she is operational deployable. Other barriers to reduce drug addiction, overdoses, and suicide in the special forces include a lack of highly trained psychologists qualified to deal with complex cases, plus the culture and occupational stigma of seeking help. In addition, the Army's commitment, and pay very attention to this part, the Army's commitment to optics management is in direct conflict with its ethical duty of care to its soldiers. You cannot pretend that everything is okay to make managing optics your priority. You cannot put people and optics first. It has to be people first. And that actually has to mean something. So the clip I'm going to be playing has to do with Afghanistan. Over on my timeline, I have articles. Just go over to the timeline and do a Control F for Afghanistan if you want to see some articles I captured from a few years ago. When the U.S. and British forces invaded Afghanistan in October 2001, poppies were grown on around 285 square miles. The new figure showed production had increased more than fourfold in 15 years. Now poppy was being grown to about 1,200 miles. This clip is going to tell you what you need to know. It will be talking about what is going on right now. Big question I have, where did all of the money go that came out of this U.S. military operation? Oh, wait a minute, I forget. It went to them. They collect your tax dollars to do these operations. All of the money they make from these operations goes directly into their pockets. How is the financing set up? Well, I don't know. Probably City of London, probably the Vatican. There is likely a central source where all this money from all these operations is being sent to, and I do not know where the money is. I need to say this. My father was a U.S. Air Force officer. He served in the Korean War. He was a navigator. My father also died of cancer in the esophagus from his duty. Now, did he get cancer from his service during Korea, or did he get cancer from that mask he had to wear when he was flying in those Air Force planes? So I do have a personal deal in this fight. I feel very angry when I start to talk about Korea and my father's role because I don't know what my father's role was after that. Where were all the pilots after the war? After Korea, where'd my dad fly to? Were they getting him to fly children around? I don't know. So just full disclosure, I have some very complicated feelings around this issue. So the clip is going to play now. I hope that you take it all in. The audio for this clip is horrific. I'm talking horrific. This guy speaking is a wonderful person, but he makes me sound like I've got top grade audio. So put on your headphones if you want to hear, because what he has to say is something we all need to hear. These are the people in charge. These are the people that are going to be coming down on the rest of us. Do you realize that not only do we have U.S. military bases all over the United States also, we also have drone bases all over this country. So you think this is going on in other countries? Soon it's going to be going on right here. So be safe out there, and goodbye for now.
Joining us now is Seth Harp. He is a contributing editor at Rolling Stone, and he's the author of the forthcoming book, The Fort Bragg Cartel, in July of 2025. We're excited to see him. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So the reason we booked you is not only because of your forthcoming book subject, but because of a graph that really caught our eye. Let's put this up there on the screen. A lot of perhaps counterintuitive, depending on what you thought about the U.S. presence in Afghanistan. But according to the Financial Times, poppy growing in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, has fallen 99% since the U.S. withdrawal. So, Seth, considering the title of your book, considering a lot of discussion over the last 20 years about opium and the U.S. role in cultivation, poppy and heroin, what do you make of that graph? And considering what you're writing about, what can you shed light on some of the background of why that is?
Well, it's really stunning, and it's only now that the Taliban has been in control of Afghanistan for several years that we're able to fully judge what the true history of the heroin trade in Afghanistan really was and its significance from 2001 to 2021 during the 20 years of U.S. occupation. Before the Taliban took over and completely eradicated the country's entire poppy crop, it was kind of difficult to say who was responsible for that drug production. But actually what the Taliban have just done in 2022 was an exact repeat of something that they did in 2001, which was to eradicate all drug production from Afghanistan, poppy cultivation, and the synthesis of heroin in laboratories. And in the process of writing the book, I learned a lot about the heroin trade in Afghanistan and compiled basically a list of facts that I think every American citizen should know about their government's support for international drug cartels, which actually goes back to the 1980s. So I'd be happy to run down, or if you guys just want to ask questions in general about the subject.
Go off.
Go ahead.
Anyway.
Tell us what you got.
Yeah.
Like I said, U.S. U.S. support for drug traffickers in Afghanistan goes back to the 1980s, when the Soviet army occupied Afghanistan. And a lot of people are familiar with the so-called Charlie Wilson's War, America's covert war in Afghanistan to drive out the Soviet occupiers by arming and funding certain warlords to wage guerrilla war in that country against the Russians. And it's also pretty well known that a lot of these people were radical Islamists, and that this covert program led to the formation of Al-Qaeda and the events that led to 9/11 or contributed to it. That was in the background of it. But it's less well known that those same mujahideen, as they're often called, many of them were deeply involved in the drug trade. This is something that we don't hear much about, although it is out there in the open. I think that Steve Cole, writing for the Washington Post in the early 90s, was one of the first to describe this. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Nassim Akhundzada were two of the biggest recipients of CIA cash and arms, and both of them were two of the biggest narcos in Afghanistan. And once the Russians had successfully been driven out, they set about transforming Afghanistan essentially into the world's largest poppy plantation, because the geography and climate of Afghanistan are very advantageous for the cultivation of poppy. And through their brutal methods, they forced a lot of Afghanistan's peasantry into conditions of essentially narco serfdom, and obligated people to plant poppy when in the past they had been planting food crops or fruit. And so the 1990s in Afghanistan is a kind of forgotten interlude, but there was a drug war there, essentially the same as there was a drug war in Colombia, and there is one in Mexico today. And the Taliban actually emerged as a reaction to the infighting between these warlords. And, we hear a lot about the Taliban's wicked ideology and their repression of women and how they don't allow music and kites and things like that. But we never hear about their anti-narcotics agenda. But that was actually fundamental to their ideological identity from the very beginning. The Taliban, as you might imagine, being such a conservative movement, didn't look kindly upon the production of drugs or the consumption of drugs either. And as I alluded to a moment ago, once they had consolidated control of Afghanistan's major population centers after a civil war in the 1990s, they completely eradicated all of the heroin production that was taking place in Afghanistan in 2001. That eradication effort was completed in the summer of 2001. And some experts at the time described it as the most dramatic event in the history of drugs markets. The history of illegal drug markets. They completely decimated the world supply of heroin, eliminated something like 95% of heroin from the global black market. That was, as I said, in summer of 2001.
Seth, let me pause you for 1 second because I have a question about that piece that also connects with today. What sort of tactics did they use to have this level of complete eradication?
That's a good question. As far as I can tell, they just went around telling people, hey, you can't do that anymore. They didn't dump pesticides from airplanes. They didn't use any of the heavy-handed eradication methods that the U.S. and its proxy forces or client states have used in countries like Colombia, for example. Very low-tech methods using sticks to beat down the plants or tractors to uproot fields. And
were people just afraid of the consequences of not listening to the Taliban?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I suppose so. I mean, the obvious answer is yes. The the government has a monopoly on the use of force there, and people didn't disobey when told to stop growing poppy. So sure, they could fear the consequences. But I'm not able to find very many reports of violence in this latest eradication campaign. A few sporadic shootings between traffickers that resisted. But for the most part, they seem to have just asked people nicely.
And so when we invade Afghanistan, what is our relationship to the cultivation of poppy?
Well, so the U.S. invaded Afghanistan just 5 months after they had completely eradicated poppy from Afghanistan. And that invasion force was led by the CIA, backed by JSOC and Delta Force. And they immediately teamed up with many of the same narco warlords that had taken refuge in the north of the country, which was the only part of Afghanistan where heroin production was still taking place. And we called that group of militias and warlords the Northern Alliance. And not all of, I don't want to say that every single one of the individuals that was part of that effort was involved in drug trafficking, but many of them, especially the Tajik and Uzbek warlords, Rashid Dostum, I think chief among them, were deeply involved in the international heroin trade, and the CIA knew it. And when they installed the new Afghan government led by Hamid Karzai, one of the government's first actions was to legalize poppy cultivation.
Yes.
A fact that went almost entirely unremarked in the American press. Within a single year, heroin production in Afghanistan was back to pre-Taliban highs of production. There were known narcotics traffickers in control of all of Afghanistan's major heroin-producing areas, including the Helmand, Nangarhar, Kandahar, Jalalabad, all these areas where either poppy was cultivated or heroin was trafficked internationally. And within 8 years, Afghanistan was producing 10 times more heroin than the rest of the world combined. It was the largest drug output. It was the largest production of heroin or any drug in world history. I mean, I really want to emphasize the scale of this. Heroin in Afghanistan, the production of it was around topped out and stayed at the level of about 1,000 metric tons of pure heroin per year for almost 15 to 20 years on end. That's double the global demand for heroin. So they're producing twice as much heroin as the entire world can absorb. Mexico is a second place producer, only puts out about 50 tons of heroin a year. Colombia, 20 tons of heroin. The only other country that's even on the map is Myanmar, and I think they produce like 1 or 2 tons.
Wow.
And again, Afghanistan producing 1,000 tons of pure heroin per year.
So Seth, to stick with then the title of your book, what is the role of our own government in not only the cultivation? I know at one point we were actively wanting to create cultivation of poppy. In fact, in preparation for this segment, I found criticism of the Taliban from the U.S. Institute of Peace by some Afghan scholar who was like, why the Taliban shutting down opium production is bad for Afghanistan. And I was like, what? Oh, I mean, this just seems a little bit too naked here. So is the cynical take correct? I mean, what exactly was going on in terms of our own government, our military, in helping stoke this production?
It's very hard to understand what these people were thinking in allowing this. They didn't talk about it very much during the war. And to the extent they did, it was very much in line with that article that you just referenced by the U.S. Institute for Peace, basically implicitly saying, hey, this is good for the economy. This is a way for Afghan
It's like a jobs program. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. But at the same time, we always heard during the war that the Taliban were responsible for this, and that the insurgency and all the drug production were really two sides of the same coin. From our politicians, from our most prestigious and trusted institutions and media, we always heard that the Taliban were narco-terrorists, was the term that I think was invented in the early 2000s to describe this. And anytime we heard about the drug production that was going on in Afghanistan, which was very much soft-pedaled and very much not in the news, but to the extent it was, we always heard that the Taliban were responsible. Now, in looking into this, I found that there's no evidence to support it at all. And I don't claim that my research skills are exhaustive, but if there's anyone out there who can find a case of a named Taliban individual who was seized or apprehended or convicted, or it was otherwise shown for a fact that they were producing or trafficking drugs, please get in touch, because I wasn't able to find a single case of that. And, you know, you don't have to take my word for it, because in 2018, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR, they put out a report, a retrospective on narcotics in Afghanistan. And this is a U.S. government publication. So, you know, they kind of couch it in delicate terms, but it's very clear from reading that report that their conclusion that they came to was that there was never any evidence at all to back up the idea that the Taliban were either profiting from the direct participation in drug production, or were even taxing it, as we sometimes heard. The best I think you could say is that at times, some groups that were called Taliban, which is actually a more diverse coalition than we realize, some of those groups at times in certain places may have levied attacks on other drug traffickers. But that's beyond that. There's no reason to think that the Taliban participated in the drug trade. It also goes against, you know, their, as I mentioned before, their original ideological identity of being a force that was against narcotics. The Taliban would occasionally put out edicts that banned their own fighters from using drugs or participating at all in the drug trade. We never gave them any credit for that, but in fact, it seems to be pretty consistent on their part. Now,
and Seth, Seth, to the economic point, Afghanistan, obviously a poor country, under sanctions by the U.S. We also withheld a significant chunk of their central bank reserves. After we left, there was a sort of economic free fall, at least for a certain period of time. So what has been the economic impact of the total eradication of poppy production when it was so central to the agricultural economy?
Well, it's hard to say. Probably not good for the farmers that have immediately lost out on their poppy revenue that they were making. But Afghanistan has really serious economic problems as a result of the crushing international sanctions that are on them, and the fact that the U.S. basically just stole all the money that was in their bank by freezing it. So Afghanistan is in a terrible economic situation right now, which makes it all the more remarkable that the Taliban was willing to eliminate what had been the majority, of their GDP. It really shows that they were determined to eliminate this trade from Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's shocking about this is that it turns a lot of stuff on its head. Like you said, Seth, I worked in that space for a long time. I covered the Pentagon during the Afghan war. We heard constantly narco-terrorists, that these people were involved in drug production, that they were much more drug lords than they were this. But then it's a little bit counter. If all of that gets shut down the moment that they actually take over the country, you would presume that the inverse would happen, that when you have total control over state resources, you would ramp opium production up. So then if they weren't producing the opium, somebody was, and somebody was profiting. I'm sure you don't want to give away too much, but to what role can you speak about from your own book to the deep involvement of the U.S. military forces in perhaps not only officially sanctioning this, but getting involved in the actual moving and selling of drugs?
Well, that same Saigar report that I mentioned a moment ago is unequivocal about this. Mm-hmm. The U.S.-backed Afghan government at every level and at every geographic region of Afghanistan was either directly involved in producing drugs or was profiting from it in the form of bribes or taxation. All of the major warlords who comprised the U.S. client state, under Hamid Karzai originally and under Ashraf Ghani later, were known narcotics traffickers. Fahim Khan was Hamid Karzai's defense minister. He was a big-time drug trafficker. Hamid Karzai's half-brother, Ahmed Wali Karzai, was the kingpin of Kandahar, who had as they would say in Mexico, the derecho de piso over the entire Helmand, the ability to charge drug traffickers, a commission to move drugs through Kandahar. I mentioned Rashid Dostum a moment ago, up on the border of Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. He was a major drug lord. The CIA worked closely with him. Hazrat Ali in Jalalabad, another big-time drug trafficker controlling the drug trade from Afghanistan to India, which absorbed a lot of the heroin during this time. And these are all people who have names, whose role is known. And the way that it was done out in the open is really kind of jaw-dropping. And it's not just the people at the top. It's, as the Saigar report said, people at every single level and every department of the Afghan government were directly involved in the drug trade. And if you ask any grunt who served in Afghanistan, a Marine, whatever, they'll tell you that the security forces of these people under these warlords, they used drugs constantly and were often too stoned on hashish or opium to even go out and patrol. So the Afghan client state was the world's biggest drug cartel, and it was directly backed at all times by JSOC, the CIA, and the whole of the U.S. government. And past instances of CIA complicity in the drug trade that we're familiar with pale in comparison. There's the whole Dark Alliance thing that reporter Gary Webb revealed in the 90s that the CIA knew that the Nicaraguan Contras were trafficking cocaine from Colombia through Mexico into the United States at the time of the crack boom. I mean, that was significant, but there's just no comparing the scale of this. As I mentioned before, for 20 years, Afghanistan inundated the entire world with extremely cheap, extremely potent, and extremely high quality heroin. It was available everywhere, and that changed. That had a huge impact on history, an extremely deleterious effect on the social fabric of many countries that directly surround Afghanistan, including Iran had a terrible heroin crisis during this time. China as well had to really crack down on heroin trafficking through Xinjiang, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, in the Uyghur-occupied part of China. Russia suffered a terrible heroin crisis during this time. All of Europe and, of course, America. And it was all the result of having a huge glut of very high quality and very cheap product that was available.
Seth, my last question for you is an intentionally naive one. How does this square with the U.S.'s relatively draconian anti-drug policies?
Well, when you say relatively draconian anti-drug policies, I guess you're referring to the criminal penalties that are available to punish traffickers that are caught here in the U.S. Well, it just goes to show that, the government really kind of, instead of fighting a drug war, it's more that they pick winners and losers in the game and say who is allowed to traffic drugs internationally. Because if the DEA at any point had wanted to look at Afghanistan and say, sometimes when they describe a drug trafficking organization in Mexico, let's say, and create like an organization chart and put this guy at the top and say these guys are his lieutenants, a lot of that there's some artistic license that goes into that. These groups are not as coherent as you might think. My point is that if at any point they had wanted to look at Afghanistan and describe what was going on there as a cartel and create like an organization chart, it easily could have been portrayed as, this is the most profitable, productive, and dangerous drug trafficking organization in the entire world. And it's inundating the United States with heroin because the heroin crisis in the United States perfectly coincided with this time period. And there's endless reports from the early 2000s from medical professionals and others, especially county sheriffs, talking about how they were seeing a much increased supply of heroin in the most remote rural counties in the United States, not just the cities. The whole country was saturated by heroin that was white in color, high quality, high potency. Now, as a caveat, the DEA says that none of this came from Afghanistan. They say that the United States alone in the world is the only country untouched by Afghan heroin. And that's a claim that you see sometimes repeated in mainstream media accounts during this time. And in my book, I'm going to go into all the reasons why I don't think that's true at all. I think that all of that supply, or the great majority of that supply that directly caused the heroin crisis in America, was a consequence of the war in Afghanistan.
I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, well, Seth, we're going to let you now get back to writing that book because we're now all dying to read it and see what else you have to say. And I hope you'll come back on when the book is published, if not before, and explain in detail your additional findings there. Thank you so much for joining us today, though. It's been eye-opening, absolutely eye-opening.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Definitely. Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.